Now, don't get me wrong, the spear is one of the most successful weapons throughout human history. In fact, since prehistory, throughout the classical period, right the way through the Middle Ages, and manifested, of course, in the pike of the age of pike and shot. It's got incredible reach, it's very quick. Due to leverage, it can attack high and low. It can even attack multiple opponents, turn around, and although it's got huge reach, it can also be brought back to fight at really close range very quickly. So it's an incredibly versatile weapon, and of course has dominated human warfare. And as well as dominating in hand-to-hand combat, of course it can also be thrown, leading to specialized versions like the Roman pilum. And any of you that have sparred with a spear, so anybody involved in HEMA or reenactment or things like this, any kind of martial art, will be able to tell you how formidable the spear is, either to use or to go against. A combination of its reach, its speed, its leverage and its versatility, and even being able to turn around quite quickly and fight at very close range, mean that it is truly the king of weapons. So the question here is, given that the spear is so awesome and so formidable, why didn't all medieval infantry use them? Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. So the first thing to say is that obviously throughout most of human history, in fact the most common combination for hand-to-hand combat troops anywhere in the world where they had access to this technology was a shield and a spear. It doesn't matter whether you're looking at Native Americans, all over Africa, all over Asia and all over Europe. So in fact for most of the Middle Ages and of course the classical period, antiquity, that some form of shield and some form of spear were absolutely the default go-to armaments of infantry, of armies all over the world basically. So long as they had shields, so long as they had spears, they used them together. They're the obvious, logical equipment to give your soldiers because they give you the maximum reach and offensiveness with the spear. It's useful obviously against other infantry, but also against cavalry, and you can throw it if you need to, if it's the right type of spear. And of course the shield, without having to develop complex armour, gives you good protectiveness both in close combat and against missile weapons like slings and arrows. So I'm in no way denying that these were the most common weapon set of most humans who had access to these objects. But the real question here therefore is, if these were so successful, the shield and the spear together, why weren't they used more extensively in the late medieval period in Europe? But just a quick word about our fantastic sponsors for this video, Surfshark. I've been using Surfshark for the last several months and it's absolutely awesome. Now, these days it's more important than ever to use good protection, whether it's a really good quality medieval helmet, whether it's the latest HEMA gloves or whether it's a VPN, and Surfshark is a great choice. Now, a VPN is a virtual private network and lots of people use them, I do, and if you're not already using one then you probably should be, and I've got a great offer for you right here. So in the last few months I've actually travelled quite a lot, both for work and for pleasure. I'm very lucky, and I've spent a lot of time in airports, hotels, train stations, places like this where you can connect to Wi-Fi, and you absolutely should only be doing that with a good VPN. What Surfshark does is it encrypts all of the information coming in, going out, and means that your information can't be copied, stolen, and people can't snoop on what you're doing. You know, Surfshark is a no-logs VPN. They aren't all, so even they won't keep a record or monitor what you're doing on the internet. If you want, you can even block ads with it. And whatever regional controls affect your online life, you can control it and get around it with Surfshark. And it's not just about getting around rules and regulations. You can also use the internet with less geographical bias. And for example, you'll be able to see shows on Netflix by choosing a different region than you wouldn't normally be able to see on there. And with over 4,500 different servers in over 140 different locations, you can always find a location that best suits your needs. From buying some new clothes to booking flights or hotels, you can always find better deals by changing your location. And one of the great advantages of Surfshark compared to some other VPNs is that it's unlimited in how many devices you can attach to it. So you don't have to delete things or ration your use, you just add a new device and off you go. And there's absolutely no risk with Surfshark because there's a 30-day money-back guarantee and 24/7 help. So if you want to try it out, all you need to do is go right now to surfshark.com/scholarshark or use code scholarshark. And at the checkout, you'll get 4 extra months of Surfshark. So go and check it out now and thank me later. So thanks for sticking with me. Now let's get back to the topic of this video. Well, throughout history, there were one group of people who couldn't really practically use or carry spears. Archers, or in fact anybody using missile weapons. This would apply to slingers as well. And quite simply, their primary job, obviously, is to knock, draw and shoot arrows. Okay, now if you're busy doing that at the opponents, okay, then you can't be carrying a spear around. Where would you leave it? And clearly your primary job isn't hand-to-hand combat. Yes, they might have done that also as a backup. Your primary job is to be drawing and shooting arrows or slings or crossbow bolts or whatever at the enemy. So spears and shields aren't really a thing. You can't easily carry big shields, you can't easily carry big spears. Your job's to carry this. So throughout history, people operating bows and slings and other missile weapons like this couldn't really carry spears. So logically, if you're dealing with an army which has got more archers or slingers, then you're going to have fewer spearmen. The more of these you have, the fewer spears you're going to have. Archers, slingers and other missile troops can have hand-to-hand combat weapons, but they're not usually large polearms. They're usually sidearms, things that can be worn, like swords and axes and daggers. So could it be that in the late medieval period we start to see more missile troops, and therefore that partially leads to there being fewer spears? So kind of, yeah, on a simplistic level, the 13th and 14th centuries, we do see an increase in the use of common soldiers deployed as missile troops. In England, obviously, and Wales, famously longbowmen, but on the continent, particularly in France and Italy and Germany as well, crossbowmen. So if you've got a higher percentage of your army is made up of missile troops, inevitably you're going to see fewer spears in use. But of course we do still see spears in use. They're used by all sorts of troops, from the most lightly equipped, like the famous Welsh spearmen that are referred to in the Cressy campaign in 1346, being used by the English army. So yes, there are Welsh longbowmen, but there are also Welsh spearmen being used. Probably in some cases with very little armour, very, very light armour, but being highly mobile and using spears, probably quite long spears, not quite pikes yet. But we do, of course, also in the late 14th century start to see the rise of pikemen as well. And of course, in the early 14th century, we see Scottish schiltrons famously using spears to counter heavy English cavalry. So the spear was definitely being used, particularly by lightly equipped common troops, and that's where we get to our second important point. Throughout the 13th and 14th centuries, we see the rise of plate armour, augmenting mail and padded armour that had gone before. So throughout the early medieval period, people had access to mail shirts and iron helmets, but for the most part their body protection was taken care of via a large shield, much like the earlier sort of Viking, Anglo-Saxon, Frankish era shields, and later on the teardropped kind of Norman type shield, we call it that, kite shields and so on and so forth. So large shields. But as we get into the 13th century, we start to see increasing amounts of body armour. Now, for those of you who don't know, or maybe haven't worn armour, or maybe haven't tried to use spears against armour, there is a particular problem with spears against armour that could be summarised in the expression, where to stick it. Now, if we're fighting primarily, if you imagine, go back to the Viking era, a huge number of the combatants would only be protected by a helmet on their head, a shield in their hand, and a spear would be their primary weapon. They'd have a sword or an axe probably as a backup, sometimes as a primary, but usually the spear would be the primary. And indeed, if we look even at the Bayeux Tapestry, so we come forward to 1066, the 11th century, or indeed the First Crusade, 1090. So we've got people who are protected head to foot by mail with an iron helmet and some form of large shield, by that point usually a kite shield. But the spear is still highly effective against mail. As Todd and I have shown in numerous videos, you can stab something through mail if you put a bit of guts and welly behind it. So a spear is absolutely able to punch through mail shirts, and that's probably undoubtedly why right the way through the classical era, through the Roman era, the migration era, the Viking era, and all the way up until about the Third Crusade, the primary weapons of people are either lances on horseback or spears in hand on foot, and a shield, because the shield can stop a spear, but the mail shirt might not. And this really changes the nature of warfare, because if all of the combatants are wearing padded cloth armour, or perhaps in some cases no armour, or mail shirts, then spears are absolutely good enough. They've got all the advantages you need for that kind of combat. But when people start to augment the mail shirt with the coat of plates, or later on the full breastplate and cuirass like this, you cannot push a spear through steel plate like this. It's just not physically possible, so you've got to go for gaps. Now, going for gaps is all well and good, and I want it to be clear, put that down carefully, I want to be clear that absolutely spears of various lengths, particularly actually the short spear, did continue to be used on foot by knights and men-at-arms. They were used in single combats, duels on foot, and they were used on the battlefield. And of course, they're still highly effective against the people who don't have all that plate armour. Anyone who's got an open face helmet, or is wearing a brigandine and no plate on their arms and legs, you know, any kind of openings, this spear is still really effective. Maybe not as effective as it was earlier, because there's not as many openings as a simple mail shirt. But nevertheless, it's still a highly effective weapon. But when someone's covered in full harness, if they've got plated arms and legs, and they've got a helmet like this, perhaps with a visor, and they've got anything on their body like a brigandine or a breastplate, they now become really difficult targets for spears, because all the spear can fundamentally do is stab. Now, I'll come on to, there's a caveat to that, but it's really difficult to find somewhere to stab your opponent. Moreover, let's put this massive spear down for a second. If you are fighting in full plate harness like this, okay, it gives you the ability to close in on the opponent. It is no surprise or secret that in the 13th and 14th century, a new weapon comes along, not really a new weapon, but a weapon comes along that becomes incredibly important, particularly in knightly combat. The dagger, okay? And the reason, this is a good symbol of how single combat and group combat had changed. The dagger now became an indispensable and important part of knightly equipment, because plate armour enabled you to close with the opponent, take a load of hits, not be wounded by them, it doesn't matter, come into close combat, come into wrestling, jiu-jitsu range, and stick them with a dagger. It meant that someone could swing a sword at you, it would bounce off your helmet, someone could stab a spear at you, glance off your breastplate. It's not a problem to close in to dagger range against these weapons. So the nature of combat had changed and made spears less useful. But of course, as Jeff Goldblum taught us, nature finds a way, and one of those natures would be typified in something like this poleaxe. You essentially have a spear contained within here. It is part spear, part battle axe, part warhammer, on a long old shaft that gives you a lot of leverage, a decent amount of reach, not as long as a spear, but a decent amount of reach. It's got a back end you can use as well. You can use either end, you can use the middle. It can deliver a lot of force to an armoured opponent, more than most other weapons, more than practically all other weapons in fact. It's one of the most powerful weapons devised for use against plate armour, and it doesn't appear until plate armour appears. It didn't need to appear before that. There was no need for a poleaxe until plate armour existed. Nature found a way, and it was called the poleaxe. But this isn't really a spear, is it? And spears still existed, as I mentioned. Obviously, pikes and pike blocks started to exist. In fact, they came around at the exact same time as the poleaxe. So what were typical infantry armed with at this time? Well, indeed, if you were Swiss infantry, your standard armament, in fact, was a blooming great long spear. And one of the reasons was they were trying to counter enemy cavalry, whether it was Burgundian or Austrian or whoever. So they were trying to counter enemy cavalry, but importantly, and I talked about this in my, about 5 months ago, I did a video on pike blocks. One of their main jobs wasn't necessarily offensive all the time, it was to protect their missile troops. So we came back to the missile troops again, okay? And again, I referenced one of my past videos talking about wooden stakes. So English archers protecting themselves with wooden stakes, but also the knights, the people wearing these sorts of helmets and that breastplate and this poleaxe, their job was to protect the archers as well. So just the same as the bayonet is sometimes there to protect the musketman so that he can keep reloading and shooting. In the English Civil War or the 30 Years' War, the pikes are there to protect the muskets and the artillery so they can keep shooting. So very often it's the missile troops dealing out the death, and it's the people with the spears protecting the missile troops from cavalry, for example, because they can't protect themselves while they're shooting. So the spear and the pike take on a slightly different role. It's not the everyman hand-to-hand combat weapon, it's more of a protective and strategic weapon to enable the missile troops to do their job. And then the people like the knights who are actually going to wade in there into the melee and start killing people, they can now use shorter, heavier hitting weapons like poleaxes, or indeed swords, two-handed swords, maces and other types of axes, even flails. They can get in there close thanks to the armour that they're wearing, which in the year 1100 you couldn't have just waded in because you would have got full of spear thrusts and sword chops from everywhere else through or into your mail shirt or the various opened legs or face that you've got. So the armour, the plate armour, enabled a different nature to hand-to-hand combat, and the spear and the pike still existed, but they were used in more specialised ways. And we also shouldn't forget to mention shields. I've left them until last. You may have thought of the shield point before now, but that's because it's inextricably connected to the armour point. So yes, indeed, you could argue that spears become slightly less useful for normal infantry once people abandon shields, but the reason they abandoned shields was because they were wearing more armour or because they were operating missile weapons. So this sort of triangular points are inextricably connected. A greater use of missile troops, whether it be longbows, crossbows, early firearms, whatever, an increase in the protectiveness of armour, particularly plate armour and brigandine and things like this, and that also leading to therefore not needing to carry the shield, which in turn meant, well, you may as well have more missile troops, and you may as well have better armour, you may as well give them weapons which are better suited to dealing with that armour instead of spears. But of course, thanks to gunpowder, spears were to have the last word in hand-to-hand combat weapons, we could say in many, many ways, because of course that specialised nature of protecting those musketmen and that artillery, and therefore the fact that there were more muskets and artillery, partially leading to the gradual decline of armour and the less importance of the men-at-arms and those type of close combat troops, meant that the pike became more and more important and ultimately morphed into the bayonet. So you could say that even today, because many, including the British Army, many armies still have the bayonet, still occasionally use the bayonet. Bayonets have been used in Iraq and Afghanistan in a number of ways. We could say that the spear never went away, but there was a period in the late Middle Ages where I would argue the spear declined in importance, even if it was more important for particular people like the Swiss and the Scottish for very specific strategic reasons, generally speaking, compared to the periods of history which had gone before, whereas this had been everybody's weapon, basically the whole army's, the whole infantry's weapon, unless they happened to be a slinger or an archer. In the late medieval period, this wasn't the de facto normal hand-to-hand combat weapon, thanks to, largely, armour. Anyway, thanks a lot for watching. I have been Matt Easton. I will certainly continue to be, and I'll see you next week for another video. Take care, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.